she began to just continuously, excuse me, stuffing this chalk down my throat, and to the point where I was gagging, so I had to reach and grab her hand. I've never seen so many people come from nowhere to put me on the floor and secure me on the floor there. It was amazing, because by the time I just grabbed her hand to move her hand and the spoon away from my mouth, these people had me jacked up and on the floor. This is at the VA hospital. I said, wow, where these people come from? I figure to this day they must have been waiting. Well, there's a Vietnam veteran in there being x-rayed, so we need to have some people down here to keep an eye out. The myth of the Vietnam veteran.
And I landed in Kennedy, and my brother-in-law, who I called from California, had driven from West Haven out to New York to pick me up so we could surprise my sister. And he was in the Air Force. He had been in the Air Force for 4 years, a Cold War type Air Force. But I expected, I guess, something from him. And we get my sea bag and my other gear off the turnstile, and we get out to his car and throw my gear in the back, and we get in and we pull away from the curb, and he looks at me and he says, well, how'd it go? I mean, you take the incident at the airport, the two incidents at the airport, and this naive, how did it go question, and it really started building on the lack of understanding what these men are coming home from. I mean, like I went on a bivouac for a weekend, and how to go was a good weather. No understanding or appreciation for what we were coming back from.
It was a hard time at that point because there were a lot of anti-war people on campus. They didn't know what to do with me. I didn't know what to do with them. There was one incident up there where they were showing a film that had been produced by the NVA about how terrible Americans were because we were using tear gas in Vietnam. And they had put a cat in a cage and used one of our tear gas grenades and set it under the cat. The cat couldn't get away from it, and the cat died from it. And everybody was, at the thing was just really uptight, and oh, how terrible Americans are, blah, blah. And I was watching the movie and going, but part of my training in basic training and in AIT was to be tear gassed.
As the 70s faded into the 80s, the nation began to recover some of its pre-Vietnam optimism. As part of that, we were able to look at Vietnam in a cooler light. Above all, we began to recognize the contribution of Vietnam veterans and to realize that they, more than anything else, were the real legacy of the war. A time to understand, a time to recognize their sacrifice and contribution. If we are to benefit at all from our Vietnam experience, we must understand them and the stories they have to tell. It's taken almost 20 years for us as a nation to come to grips with Vietnam. For those who served, and for us as well, it clearly has a lasting impact.
Even though my sister, who worked at the phone company at the same time, she was repeatedly making statements in a very soft and subtle way, because it's not the kind of thing that you could address me on point blank, because I was very sensitive, and I probably am still very sensitive to a lot of those issues. And in as much as possible, because it wasn't that easy to talk to me about it, my wife was also trying to get the point across that not all is well. And for the most part, I ignored it. One of the bottom reasons was that for me to accept it meant that I had to accept the fact that I was not mentally stable. And it's very easy to talk around being mentally stable, or talk about somebody else being not mentally stable. But when it's you, and there really is a very fine line between stable or unstable, and as the closer you get to that line, you really realize how frail that line is, and how frail all of us are potentially to being on either side of that line. I was terrified. I did not want to admit that I needed help, especially mental help. that's the last thing that I wanted to give up, was the fact that I was not in control. In control physically. You can go to a doctor and come back and you're okay. In control, drugs or alcohol. You can go away, be fixed, and come back, and you're okay, you're accepted. But to have problems mentally, psychologically, breakdowns, you start picking the words, and somebody goes away with that connotation, comes back. Are they ever perceived as being accepted? I don't think so. I personally don't think so.
Starting around 1975, when I began to have anxiety and panic attacks whenever I would go, I couldn't even go grocery shopping. I mean, I went because I had to, but when I would get into the store, I would start to sweat from head to toe. For the longest time, I never wore underwear because the anxiety levels were so high and I was perspiring so much that I was just too hot, and I couldn't wear, I would be outside with a short sleeve shirt and just a jacket on. I mean, I was making more heat than I needed. I think that the anxiety attacks were definitely Vietnam oriented. It wasn't until 1982 when I started to think of them as related to Vietnam and started to work on it and tell myself that the likelihood of an NVA soldier or a VC jumping out from the end of the coffee aisle in the grocery store wasn't going to happen. But I think that the 8.5 months that I was there, although when I first came back, I talked like there had been no, it was a long, overextended Boy Scout trip. We just carried weapons. And in 1982, when I first went to the Vietnam Veterans Center in New Haven, was when I started to pull together a lot of memories that I had blocked out. And I started to remember various incidences of when something had gone wrong, when we had suddenly been in combat, or there'd been an ambush. And I started to realize that there had been a lot more going on than I realized, and that I had spent a great deal of my time with my shoulders hunched up, waiting for something to happen. And I didn't really, wasn't even aware that I was doing that all of the time. It wasn't until 1982 when I really started talking about Vietnam that I began to pull out those feelings and realize that I was very uptight and anxious about things that happened there.
I have not suffered, or I do not dwell on Vietnam. I am a very multidimensional person. I'm developed technically, intellectually, and emotionally. And I think that living through an experience like Vietnam, where I learned in each of those areas, has made me part of what I am. I don't. In Vietnam there's an expression, don't sweat the small stuff. And I think that's part of my creed now. I can't get hung up over little things, or as I say, life's little crises, having lived through one of its most major follies. So I think it's helped me to be really a total person.
I remember the May Day rallies here in New Haven, where they had the National Guard lined up on State Street. And I had been out early that morning, and it was like foggy, and I was coming down Park Street, and I saw these tanks going down. I couldn't believe it. Military tanks in a city going down the street. And I'm saying, I must be losing it or something, And I ended up downtown on State Street, and there was the National Guard, Army Reserve, and they were all in platoons, and they were just lined up on the street. And I remember just standing there and talking to this black soldier, and I said, "What are you going to do? Go down on Dixon Avenue and start shooting up your own people?" I said, "You must be out of your mind. You don't even know what this weapon will do to a person's body." And I just went on and on. And then finally, this sergeant walks up to me and says, "If you don't leave here, we'll have you arrested." And I remember shouting to the black guy, I said, you're crazy, man. Don't let them force you to kill your own people. This is ridiculous. You don't even know what you're doing. So they kind of like ushered me along. And when I first came here, I was hired as a consular, you're a consul veteran. So I said, okay, fine, I can do that. I just come out of drug and alcohol rehabilitation program where I'd been counseling there as well and doing community work and what have you. So I said, I'm a pretty good counselor, you know. People used to tell me that, and I believe it. And they said, well, now you're going to counsel veterans. I said, okay, fine, I'm a veteran, no problem, you know. Little did I know that in counseling my peers, I was counseling myself.
It was very frightening. A lot of the bad things came back initially. I had a very young Vietnamese boy that I had to take in and sign papers on. And a long story, but I had tried to get him to escape. You know, it had not worked, and I finally had to take him in. Why I did at this point, I still have doubts about, but I did follow orders and turned him in. And he screamed and clawed and begged, for me to release him and take him with me and everything else. It was a very ugly scene, but it had haunted me forever. And he was killed. And I felt responsible for that, but that person came back to haunt me. And when all this Vietnam experience and thoughts came back, all I could do was hear him screaming for the longest time. And because he had come up to me and tried to hold on, when my children would come up to me, that's all I could see. That's all I could hear was this young man screaming, just a death scream. And it was very frightening.
To come home and have someone accuse you falsely of certain kinds of behaviors or atrocities, quote unquote, can hurt, especially when you cannot explain, you're not given the opportunity to explain your side of things. To do what you think is right, and then come home and find out that there are people who question what you did totally, and those who will even throw things at you literally and say that you did wrong, you know. The sad part about it is that people need to realize that once in the military, there's a tendency to think that you have control. You have no control. Military controls you. You don't control anything in the military. And those on the outside may think that this is the case, but they're wrong.
And it's a shame. It's truly a shame that the Vietnam veteran had to go what he went through. I didn't experience the negative that many did, okay? And I never have. I find that there's a lot of lost souls out there. It's gotten better from what I know, and some guys have made the break. But there are lives that will never be the same, not necessarily because they went to Vietnam, but the way they were treated when they came back from Vietnam. And I see them every day. I see them on the green. I see them in the movie theaters. You can tell. I can spot a vet a mile off. And it's a shame that they have this thing, whether they were right or wrong. It's a shame that they have this thing that they have to deal with. And I've also thrown it back in their faces, and I'm entitled to do that as a veteran. Fellas, wait a minute, don't blame it all on Vietnam. Vietnam wasn't the thing. There was a life before Vietnam, but it may have made the difference. War is a terrible thing. I think I said it earlier. It's terrible. It knows no boundaries where it is. It kills kids, it kills chickens, ducks, animals, it kills puppies, it kills kittens, it kills grandmothers, it kills grandfathers, it kills grandchildren, it kills everything around it, okay? And you get hung up in this thing. These kids that we were over there,